Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our March 2018 AEE member webinar. My name is Michelle Whitlock. I am the Digital Communications Director here at AEE, and we are pleased to have Chris Ballback today give you guys a brief webinar on open source software. So just a couple reminders. I will send out a recording of this presentation. It'll be the audio and the visual. About a week afterward, this will go to anyone who registered, so attended or not attended. So if you have to bounce off early for any reason, you'll get a full recording of this. And just a reminder to also check our website, aeecenter.org. If you click on membership and then benefits, we have a tab on our benefits page for member webinars, and that's where you can register for these going forward. There will be a brief survey at the end of the webinar. I think it's 3 or 4 questions. If you don't mind filling that out, that will greatly help us in the future. So I am going to introduce our presenter and let him take it away. So Chris serves as Vice President of Research and Development for Performance Systems Development of New York, LLC, a technology-focused firm implementing market transformation activities to utilities and communities and customers nationwide. A professional engineer registered in New York State, Chris has more than 15 years of experience working in the field of energy efficiency. He is especially passionate about the proper use of energy simulation tools to improve the built environment and the application of measurement and verification procedures to validate investments made to improve energy efficiency. Chris is the current Vice Chair of ASHRAE TC 4.7 Energy Calculations, a voting member of ASHRAE TC 4.7 and ASHRAE TC 7.6 for Building Energy Performance, and ASHRAE Standard 211, which is the Commercial Building Energy Audits. Chris is a longtime supporter and instructor of AEE's Measurement and Verification, Certified CMVP certification, and the Energy Modeling, our BESA courses. So without further ado, I will hand this over to Chris.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for the kind introduction. Let's see here. Okay. So welcome, everybody. Welcome to today's short webinar. We only have about 45 minutes together today, and I'd like to spend our time talking about how the use of open source software is transforming the energy services sector. And I'd like to begin just with some acknowledgments, thanking our colleagues at AEE for sponsoring this webinar, thanking my colleagues at the Department of Energy and our supportive U.S. National Energy Labs for their efforts with promoting open source software, and also thanking a couple private sector companies who I'll be demonstrating as a part of this webinar, who are also advocates of the open source software movement. And finally, thanking all of you for taking time out of your busy day today to attend this webinar and hopefully take something away from it and learn something new. So in our short time today, I'll throw up a strawman agenda. We'll try to follow it. We're on time so far. We'll spend the first 15 minutes or so discussing some common principles and terms. We'll spend about 5, maybe 10 minutes talking about some common open source software licensing models. We'll spend the remainder of our time, 15 to 20 minutes, actually looking at some software licensing arrangements and actual software that I use in my daily workflows to support both energy modeling and measurement and verification activities. And then at the end, if there is time, and I hope there is time, we will open the floor for some questions. I did offer to Michelle that, of course, folks, if they ask questions, you'll have to do it through the questions or the chat window in your webinar feedback pane. And I will make every attempt that I can, if I can't answer those questions during this webinar, to answer them in a separate document and share those with the recording and the PDF of this webinar. So let's start off with a poll. I'm going to begin here just with a simple poll. Let's see if I can kick this off. It's you should see something on your screen, the first question there. I'm just asking, I'm sort of gauging who my audience is. We have looks like a little bit over 100 attendees today, and to take a moment to answer the question. I'm going to leave that open for about another 15 seconds or so. I really just again want to gauge the awareness of the folks I'm speaking to today. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now and share the results with you. The poll question here again was, do you use open source software in your daily business practices? And it looks like 31% of you responded as yes, and 69% responded as no. And that's interesting. I would say to you that if you have at your workplace, if you're running a server that's running a Linux operating system, if you're hosting any sort of web services using Apache HTTP server, if you're own and operate an Android phone, if you're using a Firefox web browser, if you're, again, developing websites using Drupal or WordPress, or even if you're using OpenOffice or LibreOffice to generate spreadsheets or documents, if any of those answers are yes, if you're using any of those very popular business tools, then yes, you are using open source software in your daily business workflows. And it's sort of a hidden thing. It's a lot of people don't think about it, but it's there. It's there every day, every moment, behind the scenes, running a lot of your business processes. So odds are, if you were to think about that, you would probably answer yes if we were to do this again, maybe at the end of the webinar. So this is relatively a new thing, I think, for many of you to even be thinking about. And to start, let's set a foundation here. Let's go way back. When did all of this start? I'm dating myself a bit by saying that I was around, of course, in 1984 when this all started with the release of an editor, a text editor called Emacs. I'm sure most of you are aware of Linux, which was, again, given birth 1991. Linux was released, the first operating system released under an open source agreement, an open source license. After that, we started to see programming languages being released under the open source software licensing schemes. Python and Ruby, two programming languages that are still very active today. And some of you may remember in the late 90s, what I would call the browser wars. We had a browser called Netscape Navigator, Netscape Communicator. It was an open source internet browser. And then Microsoft came on the scene with their product, Internet Explorer version 4.0, which was closed source. And there was a great debate over the influence and power of these open versus closed source web browsers in the late 90s. The late 90s really kicked off what I would call a movement in open source. It was the beginning of a discussion around the use of open source software to develop products that are suitable for building business workflows around. So not just programming languages, not just operating systems, but actually products that you would choose to use in your, again, daily business workflows. That was a key moment where we started to see companies adopt these open source tools, open source software products for what I would call formal commerce, late 90s. So it really hasn't been that long, 20 years, 25 years, something in that time frame. So we really need to set another foundation, which is the principles of open source software, the core principles. And as you can see here, I've listed them in bullet form. I'm not going to read them off. I'm going to highlight a few of them. The ones that I hold most true to is to encourage transparency, what's actually underneath the hood of the software you're using, to discourage meritocracy, which is another way of saying to make sure that the knowledge of what's underneath the hood is not just in the hands of a small community of developers. It's dispersed amongst a large group of people. The other principles here are really very closely oriented to democracy. You can see the open exchange of information, collaborative participation, community-oriented development, and so forth. The principles of open source software align very well with the principles of democracy. And the last bullet there is the most important one that we're going to focus on today, which is open source software has one very important non-negotiable tenet, which is that the source code of that software must be made available so that anyone, you, me, your neighbor, guy across the street, can inspect, can modify, can enhance the software itself. And they can do that under the terms that are defined by an open source software license. So that's a key point that we're going to keep harping on when we talk about open source software in this presentation. Some people will confuse free software with open source software. So I created this slide to give a demonstration of an application we're probably all familiar with, which is unzipping files. Unzipping zip files. And this slide has 3 different applications, the websites you can go to download, 3 different free, you don't have to pay for any of these applications. All 3 will allow you to unzip zipped files, but all 3 have different mechanisms, again, for licensing. The top one is a mechanism that we call freeware, which essentially means, hey, you can download this software, but you cannot have access to the source code. Therefore, it is not open source software per our previous slide. It's free, but it's not open source. The second model is a model called shareware, where yet again, you can download the software, don't have to pay any money, no expense incurred. You can use it for a trial period, some trial period of a defined length, and then you're encouraged. You're not required, you're not forced, but you're encouraged to then purchase the software once the trial period has ended. And again, the shareware model does not provide users access to the source code, so it does not meet the definition of open source. And the third option we have here is a true open source option, the option called 7-zip, where yes, you don't have to pay, it is free. You can download the 7-zip application. You can also inspect the source code, you can modify it, you can use it, and you can redistribute it to others. Again, within the restrictions of the defined open source license. So don't, again, this is a really subtle but important point that free software does not necessarily mean it's open source. In order for a piece of software to be considered open source, one must have access to the source code and be able to modify, use, and distribute it within the restrictions of the appropriate license. Let's set a few more foundational pieces here. Let's start introducing some terms that are appropriate for licensing of software. So of course we have the licensor. That's the person who creates the software. Often it's a company, it's not an individual, because the company owns the rights, the company owns the IP that an individual working for them might create. They're the licensor. The licensee, well, that's a party who's using licensed work. They're using the work. Licensees can generally be broken up into two different groups. Licensees who are developers, they intend to take this work, this software, and create a derivative from it, create something, extend it, redistribute it. That's one type of licensee. The second type of licensee is an end user. So again, I actually play both roles in my my role here at PSD. As an end user, I'll be using the open source software to become more efficient on delivering energy engineering services as an end user. And as a developer, I'll be inspecting code, and I'll be taking pieces and parts of that code and putting it into our software tools, honoring again the software license of the original work. Which brings us to the term license, which is essentially a contract. It's a formal contract, and the terms of the contract are between the licensor, the licensee, and they define how the work is to be used. So they define the rights and obligations of both the licensor and the licensee. What are you allowed to do? And finally, one last term, a derivative work, only again applicable to someone who would call themselves a developer. Developers create derivative work. So they take existing work by others and create something new from it. That's what we would refer to as a derivative work. These are common terms and conditions that are going to show up in open source licenses, software licenses. So we'll set a foundation by having a common understanding. I'm sure many of you have seen something like this before when you've installed what we'll call closed source software, some pop-up window that will have an EULA end use license agreement. There's a big scroll bar on the right, and there may be hundreds and thousands of words in there, and they may even be in a foreign language. And hopefully you read them, because yes, you are entering a contractual agreement. When you click the box there, yes, I have read and understood these, you're entering another agreement. It's certainly not an open source agreement. Whatever is in this end use license agreement, you have to honor, essentially. So just pointing out the difference between open source licensing agreements, allowing the user to inspect, modify, and redistribute code, and closed source licensing agreements, which certainly will not allow a user to even see the source code. Therefore, they can't modify it, they can't inspect it, they certainly can't redistribute it. A different contractual agreement. So, we use software every day. All of us use software every day in our business workflows. We probably haven't spent a lot of time thinking about what are the terms and conditions of the software we use. Some of it's very simple. It's closed source, Microsoft Office Suite, Adobe Acrobat, whatever it might be. Some of it is a little bit more difficult to understand. Like, is this a closed source software or an open source software? And what I'm trying to share with this slide is that if you can't determine, in other words, if you're using some software that you cannot actually determine what the licensing of that software is, well, as it says in the first bullet there, never consider the absence of a license as an implicit grant for you to do whatever you want with the work. Now, this happens a lot when we go to our friend Google and we search for, say, spreadsheets or macros or whatnot, and we're borrowing pieces from here, other things from here, and Frankenstein something together. Well, essentially, we are using software work created by others, and most of that stuff is not licensed. There is no license, which means without a specific license, the author of the work hasn't waived any of their rights. And you as a user, or if you're using that work for commercial purposes, you're actually exposing yourself to some risk that you may not be aware of. So be very careful about this when you're using, again, software, anything that can be determined to be software that doesn't have a clear license. This is why, again, we want to try to use software that has a clear open source license or a clear closed source license. It really eliminates the risk that we perceived or real risk that we may be taking in our business workflows. So common open source software licenses, there's a slew of them. I've taken on this slide, I've taken the top 6 in terms of what we see a lot in the work that I do. You'll see the columns here, the 6 common open source license terms names, starting from the left, what we call the GPL license, to the right, which is the BSD3 or BSD4 license. And I'll point out the top row, which I've highlighted in yellow. You can see, I believe that's really important for many of us on this call. Many of us are probably what we would consider to be end users. We want to use the software in some sort of commercial purpose, use it to become more efficient. And any piece of open source software that's carrying one of these 6 licenses would allow us as end users to do that. We're legally allowed, contractually allowed, to use the open source software for what we would call commercial use, commercial gain, any of them. The next 3 rows that follow below the yellow row, the first row at the top, are really more related to developers, folks who want to take somebody else's work and create a derivative, create something from it. And as we can see, each of the license terms that we're listing here, they handle the work, the derivative works a little bit differently. So the least restrictive licenses are on the right side of this slide, the BSD3, BSD4. They basically say, you can take this open source software, you can make a copy of it, you can do whatever you'd like to it, redistribute it, no problems. Make a copy, make it yours, do what you'd like. That's the far right. The far left, as an opposing view, says something like, you can take an open source piece of software, you can make a copy of it, you can redistribute it, but you need to redistribute it with the same copyright license that you received it from. You cannot change the license. So that's the GPL licensing terms. And then again, the sort of mix, the 3 or 4 columns in the middle are various levels of compromise between those 2 extremes. There are many other software licensing terms. You perhaps have heard the term public domain before. I didn't put it on this slide, but public domain software actually is, and there is a license, which is referred to as the public domain license. And if you apply a public domain license to your work, you basically give away all rights. All rights. You know, you're putting all of the risk and the reward onto others. You own nothing from it. So it's another example of an open source software license that one could use. You might want to know, like, where do I get open source software? Where does it come from? You don't go down to your Best Buy or your Staples to buy it, you know, shrink wrapped, or buy it online with a subscription. You go to public, what are known as public repositories. Repositories are, again, places, they're development platforms where open source code is publicly stored and accessible. So on this slide, I've listed the top, again, my top, I should say, top 5 public repositories where you can find any number of open source projects that are there. And because they're open source, you can inspect them, you can modify them, you can redistribute them, again, with respecting the terms of their individual licenses. So I would encourage you just to go to any one of these sites. You have something you're interested in, like M&V. You can search any one of these sites for that term M&V, and you might find some really interesting open source M&V projects that you might want to either use yourself or create a derivative work from. Very interesting places where these things live. For the rest of our short time together, again, only about another 20, 25 minutes, I'm going to review 9 examples of open source software that I use in my daily workflows. Now, as an M&V practitioner, as an energy modeler, these are the tools I use every day. And I use them for a variety of different reasons. So what I'd like to do is take the next few minutes and go through a few of them. We'll discuss the terms, the foundation terms that we just went through a few moments ago, so you can see the differences between them. sort of how they're licensed and how they're used. And as I'm going through, I'd like you to think again about why you might want to use them, or why, again, some other folks who I'll reference, why they're using them. Like, what's the business case for doing this? Business cases essentially come down to three words: better, cheaper, faster. If you can leverage open source software to do all three of those, give it a hard look. It might be a good use for you. It really might be a good fit. So let's begin with our first tool, which is called Energy Plus. Energy Plus is not really a tool, it's a physics engine, it's a modeling engine. It's what we would refer to as a calculation core. It is developed by the Department of Energy funding, US Department of Energy funding. And I've got the site here, the GitHub repository where it lives. It's licensed under the BSD3 software license, which you'll remember is the far right, and the far right of that chart. It's pretty, not very restrictive. So, you know, it's easy to clone and redistribute and so forth. Who is using Energy Plus? Well, there's about 35,000 downloads per version. There's new versions of Energy Plus every 6 months that are released, 35,000 plus downloads. But those are practitioners and researchers, individuals who are using it. On the right here, I'm actually showing a completely different use case, a set of users who are using Energy Plus. These are software tool vendors. Some of them you'll recognize, of course, the train company, Carrier, Autodesk, and so forth. Others you might not. Others are smaller, more startup companies, and I'm sure there are others here that I'm not even aware of. They are using Energy Plus to prevent themselves from having to build their own energy modeling physics engine. Again, because of the modified BSD3 license that lets them redistribute this Energy Plus application. So it's really an interesting case where we have serious investment happening here by software tool vendors. If each of these vendors had to replicate this engine themselves, it would not be very efficient. It just wouldn't be efficient at all. We have who's contributing to this, and I'll go show this slide in just a moment as an example, but currently there's about 43 active contributors. So you can think of each of these companies has basically a team of 43 software developers working for them, for all of them. About 22 or so are recently active, meaning they've made commits. They've been enhancing the software within the last week. And all of this is visible on GitHub. I'll show you that in just a moment. Another thing to think about with open source software is, how is it supported? You know, what's the business model for this? Well, we have a website, unmethours.org, that is largely used to support users of Energy Plus. And also there are a number of commercial service providers who provide training, design services, and whatnot as well. So there's a community that supports this open source software as well, this energy modeling physics engine. Let's just pop over to GitHub, and I'll show you how I got here. We'll start with the front end of Google. If we would just use the search term NREL GitHub, that's going to take us to the National Renewable Energy Lab's GitHub repository. We go there and we can now search for a repository called Energy Plus. This is again the link that was in the slide we saw a moment ago. And you'll see 43 contributors. Yep, you have this. 34 releases. This software has been released 34 times. It's all here. If you wanted to download old versions or whatnot, here it is. Anybody can grab it. Would you like to download it for yourself? Go for it. Here it is right there. You can go ahead and clone or download this software very simply. Would you like to fork it? It looks like 125 people have actually made copies of this and are working on their own versions. It's a lot of activity here. And finally, if we look at the 43 contributors, you can again see, if might take a bit here, but GitHub shows activity. Like, this is clearly an active project. There's lots of contributions from the community towards this project. We can pick a window in time and actually see who's doing what. You know, the community is very transparent. Last but not least, every one of these open source projects has a thing called an issue tracker. I'm sure you've used software. I'm sure you've found bugs in it before. And if it's a closed source piece of software, you're probably limited to sending an email to the company or calling them up to their help desk or whatnot. With open source software, you could file a bug report right here. Again, file a bug report, and you can track that bug report through its through completion. It's going to get tagged, it's going to get assigned, and it's going to get worked on. Or maybe it isn't. Maybe it's just going to hang on there. You know, bugs are opened every 7 days ago, 4 days ago, an hour ago, a bug got filed. So again, we can see transparency into this very complicated piece of software, primarily because it's open source. This is the whole theory of why open source software is very powerful, again, for us to leverage. One last thing here with this particular Energy Plus repository, you can see if I scroll down, I'll find a file here called license, and I can go read this license. And this is the software license of this open source code. So we could read this, but clearly somewhere in here I recall seeing yesterday, it's a version of the BSD 3 license. So again, open source projects would have something like this. These are the terms of use if you choose to redistribute this work yourself. Okay, so that's an example of an energy modeling physics engine that I again use every day. Now I'm going to talk about an example of an energy modeling middleware. Middleware, it's not the physics engine. This is a piece of middleware, which may be a new term for some of you. Middleware, you could think of it as sitting between a graphical user interface and a physics engine. So it's basically a software development kit, an API for those of us who are software developers that lets us access the physics engine. This piece of middleware is called OpenStudio. Again, it's hosted on GitHub. It has a bit of a different licensing scheme. It's not the BSD2, it's an LGPL licensing scheme. Who's using it? Well, software tool developers, practitioners, in this case, utilities, lots of utilities, and also, of course, researchers. I have a screenshot here of a number of the community members who are using OpenStudio today, and you'll see these are some sort of heavy hitters, you know, Johnson Controls and whatnot. These are large companies, also utilities that cover a large portions of the country and whatnot. They're using it, again, as middleware for accessing Energy Plus. To date, we have over 40,000 users of registered users of OpenStudio, and a number of users who are software developers, and that's a big deal here. Who's contributing to it? Well, we can go look again. We would see if we went to the GitHub site, active contributions here. 33 active contributors, well, 15 within the last week, who are submitting either bugs or fixes. They're moving the code along. OpenStudio is an example of a piece of open source software that actually releases every 2 weeks, roughly 2 to 3 weeks. There's a new version that comes out. Roughly every 3 months, a new major version. So very fast moving piece of software here. How is it supported? How is this open source middleware supported? Well, again, community support through unmet hours, and also a number of commercial service providers who will provide fee for service consulting or training or individual mentoring services. So it's interesting though, again, Energy Plus and OpenStudio here, two open source software tools that work together with one another. They have different users. One more example of this, just to say it's not just those two by any means. A third example here, which is an example of another energy modeling physics engine. The name of this engine is CSE, which stands for the California Simulation Engine. So here is another open source energy modeling engine, physics engine, primarily aimed for residential buildings, and it's used by the California Building Energy Code Compliance tool. It's known as CBEC Res. So CBEC Res tool is wired up to this open source engine. There's a number of practitioners and researchers who are also using this tool, and some popular software tools. You may be familiar with RightSoft or Energy Pro or BOPS. They also connect to the CSE engine, use it as a back-end energy calculation core. So again, who's contributing to it? Well, if we were to go look at this on GitHub, we'll see not quite as many people as Energy Plus and OpenStudio, only 3, but they're very active, and you can see what they've been doing. I would describe this as a nascent OpenStudio project or open source project, meaning watch it. If it picks up traction, we'll see more people contributing to it. How is CSE supported? Well, again, unmethours.org, the community website, a community support, as well as a well-documented user manual and a commercial service provider who's providing support for CSE and the applications that use it. So just another example of an engine. How might you use this? Maybe you would like to understand an algorithm for modeling infiltration in a house or something like that. Well, you could go to this website, you could download the source code, you could search it, you could find it, and you could take it and put it into a spreadsheet. That would be within the terms of use of this BSD2 license. So again, think of where there's a lot of what I would call IP or intellectual property in these open source modeling engines that could be reused to create economic activity elsewhere. The next tool I'd like to show and share with you is called DView. This one's very, very useful in my day-to-day workflow. It's a generic standalone application, and it's useful for visualizing time series data. I say time series simulation data. It could just as easily be time series measured data, from measured metered data, if you will. And it will, again, open up CSV files or weather files, structured data files, database files as well, and allow the user to visually see this data. Now, wow, that's kind of cool. I could do this in Excel or other closed source tools, but again, this tool has an MIT license to it. It's open source using the MIT open source license, which means I can use this for commercial purposes every day as a user, no problems. Take screenshots from it, export, use all of its features, no problems at all. And you'd say, well, okay, who's using this tool? Well, again, there's a couple software tool vendors who've actually embedded this viewer into their tool. So OpenStudio is one example, and the BOpt tool. Because of this licensing agreement, they've buried dview inside their application itself. It prevented them from having to design their own. Of course, practitioners like myself are using it, and researchers are using it. It's a great tool for high-resolution data visualization. Who's contributing to it? You can go to the GitHub website. You can see 9 contributors that I could find, 6 of them recently active again. There's activity. There's interest in this project. It is not stalling out. It's gaining momentum. How is it supported? Well, it's a pretty simple application. It's really supported through Unmet Hours, the community resource, and also, again, through the issues tab that I showed you in the repository itself. Anybody can file a bug and get answers to their questions that way as well. So moving on a bit, and we have about 10 minutes here, I want to move to a different use case, which is statistical computing and graphics, producing high quality graphics for reports for customers and the calculations that go underneath those. I use a project called R project. Many of you probably heard of R. R is a statistical package. It's open source again under the GNU GPL license. Why I put this in here is R has a very large community of users, over 2 million. 2 million people using R today. There are certainly closed source alternatives that have their own feature sets and so forth, but a number of tool developers, practitioners, and researchers use R every day to create value in their business. And who's contributing to this? Well, we can go look again, thousands of people, 2 million users, you've got thousands of users who are giving it back, putting it back into the R project itself. R is not new. R has been around for over 15 years, has a very large and well-developed support community, has a very large and well-developed set of commercial service providers. You can go and get ebooks and books, literal books, e-classes, all sorts of ways to learn how to use R. But I want to point out that this version of R, this open source project, actually runs from a command line interface. You're seeing a shot of it here. You can see it says it's free software. You can distribute it under certain conditions, but you're working with a command prompt, which takes me to the next slide, which is another open source tool, open source piece of software called RStudio, which is nothing more than a wrapper. It's a graphical user interface for R. It wraps around that command line we saw just a moment ago. This makes R much more accessible to the masses, if you will, who don't want to be typing in code at a command line interface. They want to work in an integrated development environment, which is a fancy word for a graphical user interface. Who's using this? Tool developers, practitioners, and researchers again. Hundreds of people are contributing to this open source project. It's stored on the Subversion website, not GitHub. And again, a large set of community members who are supporting this. It's been around, RStudio's been around for well over 10 years. There are releases approximately every 2 weeks. Very, very active community. And for those of us who download RStudio, it's free. Teach ourselves how to use it. There's tremendous value. And again, learning how to use RStudio as an interface on top of R. Which is to say that this third set of R OpenStudio software packages that I'm pointing out is called an R package. An R package is nothing more than, you could think of it as like a macro that would be running in Microsoft Excel that you can reuse, you can call on demand. Well, in the R environment, that macro will be referred to as an R package. reproducible R code. There is a very large set of community members, mostly researchers and scientists, who are publishing these macros, if you will, these R code packages. And they're publishing them under the open source licensing agreements, MIT, GPL, public domain. You know, it's up to the developer of the work how they want to do this. But users of R via RStudio can simply, through the RStudio interface, install these packages and start using them. What's unique about these packages is that they usually include an example, sample data, full documentation. They include the help files. They include step-by-step walkthroughs of how to use them. So, boy, it doesn't get much better than that. It really is a very easy way to access some very powerful analytical tools using R. And moving on one step further, moving now into the measurement and verification use case, M&V use case. This is an example of an R package from the previous slide I talked about. It's an R package published by our friends at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. They call the package RMV 2.0. If you search for that in Google, you'll find it. You could download it using RStudio. You can run it. It's fully documented. It contains example data and so forth. And what is it? Well, again, this is an open source M&V package that allows us to develop transparent baselines for developing measurement and verification energy models for M&V that are actually very complicated models. This one's called gradient boosting machine, GBM, and a time of week and temperature model. Now I say very complicated, but because they're licensed in the BSD3 open source licensing scheme, would you like to see how complicated they are? Go on, open it up in there, go and poke around. You're free to go inspect it. You're free to make recommendations to improve it. And of course, you're free to use it. So who is using it? M&V tool developers like ourselves at PSD, practitioners like myself, and researchers like myself. This is really a nascent field. We see M&V, the automation of M&V, and particularly these methods, as developing. And the folks at LBNL have really basically continued this open source software trend where I can use this package via RStudio with the R project. The whole chain is a chain of open source software tools. And as a user, again, I can just leverage that as opposed to the alternative, buying a commercial package, or the alternative of creating my own. And last but not least, I want to give an example of another M&V package that I use quite frequently. It's called ECAM, Energy Charting and Metrics Tool. ECAM is a very special case I'll close with today, because ECAM is an add-in that lives inside Microsoft Excel, our proprietary spreadsheet tool. As an add-in, ECAM was developed using Visual Basic VBA code. And as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, with downloaded spreadsheets and whatnot, it's very hard to know whether you're working with a software tool that is licensed. And what license is it carry? Is it commercial? Is it non-commercial? Is it GNU? Is it BSD? What is it? This tool is super powerful, super easy to use, super well documented. It's used by literally thousands of M&V practitioners across the world to develop transparent M&V baselines. It's got a small group of contributors who are very passionate about contributing it and moving it along. It's hard to know, again, how many users there are out there, except from the number of users who've been trained. And again, it's right now supported through direct email support. If you go to this link, you'll follow exactly how to do that. Just in preparing for this lecture or this presentation today, I've begun a conversation with the ECAM lead developer, and we've come to an understanding that this spreadsheet add-in needs to be licensed. It right now is basically in no man's land. It doesn't carry a license, and that makes it risky for folks like you or I to use it for commercial use. It would be possible for some ambulance chaser or whatnot to come in and sue, because we would be using software we're not allowed to use for commercial use. So we've just again begun over the last week or so discussing what license would be appropriate and how to do this inside an MS Excel add-in. And that's really going to be an interesting process to see it go through. I do point this out because it's a very powerful piece of M&V software, and I would expect within the next, 2 to 3 weeks, we will see a license come along with this up on the website when you download it. And the license will be open source. I just don't know which of the possible licenses the developer will choose. So, circling back here, getting close to winding down, how are we, I work for a company, PSD, Performance Systems Development, how are we using these tools to generate value, economic value, more transactions, better, cheaper, faster? Well, we're using OpenStudio, Energy Plus, and DView basically to provide transparent and reproducible calculations to our customers. As an example, I can redistribute, I can give these open source files to someone else, tell them to download the software, they can go inspect it at their own leisure. I don't have to require them to purchase commercial software to see what I'm doing, to see my input and output files, for example. Same thing with Ecamm. I'm using Ecamm every day to produce transparent, reproducible, and accurate M&V baselighting calculations. And I'm doing that for the utility use case of a pay-for-performance program where transparency, reproducibility, and accuracy are paramount. These things have to be shown under the light of day. They can't be gray box or black box solutions. And finally, we're using our Studio and the M&V 2.0 package to do the same sort of thing, provide transparent and reproducible M&V baselines when we start working with data that Microsoft Excel just simply won't handle. Hundreds of thousands of data points, perhaps millions of data points, where Excel just simply will choke on that amount of data. And we are constantly looking for other opportunities to leverage these open source tools. Essentially, if I didn't have these sets of tools at my fingertips, I would have two choices. Purchase commercial alternatives, which again, not necessarily a bad choice, because these commercial alternatives might come with significant training and support that these guys don't. That would be choice one. Choice two, develop my own. Developing my own is just not going to happen. I don't have the time or the resources to reproduce 1/1,000,000th of the value that's in these existing tools. So thank goodness they are licensed under open source. We're working on Ecamm on open source software terms that allow myself and others to leverage them. So in summary here, I would say again, those of us in this energy space should be looking for growth in the use and adoption of open source software. If you go back to those repositories that I showed several slides ago, and you just search for your favorite term, energy audit, model, whatever it might be, you might be surprised what you turn up. There are people out there on, this is a global effort, who are working on things that you may not be aware of. And when you find those open source software projects, certainly look at the terms, the license terms. As a user, if they carry an open source license, you're free to use those software tools or whatever for your own commercial purpose. If you intend to perhaps create a derivative work, you need to read those license terms carefully to make sure that you're honoring them. But there's a world of leverage out there, again, waiting for us to discover and take advantage of. So I've kept us on time. It's 1:43. We got a couple minutes here for questions. I think I'm going to pass the talking stick back to my colleagues at AEE. And you want to go from there, Michelle?
Yes. So far, it looks like we have one question that came in. So it says I can't see their name, but the question is, how safe are the open source software tools on the mentioned site?
That's a really good question. And, it's not going to be easy to answer with a fell swoop, but the general consensus of open source projects that have a lot of activity, where you can see there's a lot of contributors, that's another way of saying there's a lot of people looking at the code. And it's not a big leap to say the more people who are looking at the code, the more people who are likely to find security flaws and bugs. So now that's, a proxy relationship that I'm making that has been proven wrong before. But you got to compare it to the alternative, which is a closed source software team of an unknown number of people who are working on it, who are focused on, unknown areas of the software. So to identify that, if I were curious, I'd actually file an issue in the open source software site, and I'd ask that question. And you'd likely get an answer from either the lead developer or the folks working in the area of the software that you're interested in. Good question, though. Thanks for asking that. Any others, Michelle?
Yes, we have one more. It says, what is the ramp up effort involved in using Energy Plus or OpenStudio for folks who aren't familiar with the platform?
That's another really good question. It's going to be difficult to answer succinctly, but I'll start by saying If one has experience in energy modeling previously from either using other open source or closed source energy modeling tools, the ramp up effort will be far smaller, far less. Those tools that we just mentioned, Open Studio and Energy Plus, have copious amounts of documentation, thousands and thousands of pages of documentation that's searchable, essentially help files, if you will. And they have a very active community membership group who will help us, help you and I as we reach, you say, well, the documentation is not sufficient, I don't understand how this works, pose a question. Within a day, you'll get an answer from a community member. So it's, again, I would say those are two broad ways to say this. The third thing to say is if you really want to get the ramp up to happen quick, there are commercial service providers who you can engage with for both mentoring and training services. And that might be a better, more individual sort of way to get up to speed for your particular use case. You can find those commercial service providers by just Googling those terms, Energy Plus or Open Studio commercial service provider, and get proposals or quotes from them for mentoring or training services. Good question, though, Jim. Thank you for that.
We have another one. How can we know if it is an open source license or a closed source license?
Okay, so when you are faced with an end user license agreement, that famous EULA inside the dialog box that makes you check it, accept the terms, you need to read those terms. And I know many of us don't. Sometimes you can print them out and probably take them to a lawyer if you really want to be serious. But odds are, if you've got that sort of arrangement, that type of an end use license arrangement, it's closed source. Okay, nobody who uses open source licensing agreements uses an end use license agreement with an acknowledgement box and whatnot. In other words, open source licensing agreements are basically baked into the software documentation. And so when you go to the place where the project is hosted, those repositories, you should search for a file called license. Inside that file, you should see the licensing terms. Again, that's for open source. Closed source, when you try to install it, you will be presented with some sort of a blocker. You can't move forward until you acknowledge this. And read those terms carefully. They'll define what the closed source terms are. And then again, there's that gray area, like a spreadsheet that I download that has no end use. I don't install it. It's just a spreadsheet I open up. Where unless it says it on a tab, which is named license or something like that, it's considered unlicensed software, which means you need to be careful how you're using it. You're opening yourself up to risk from the original licensee or licensor, sorry. I hope that was the answer to the question. I think that's how I would answer it.
Okay, is there an open source program for CMMS systems?
Oh, that's a good question. CMMS, I think we're talking about computerized maintenance management systems. I don't work in that arena, so I'm not sure. It's pretty darn easy to find out. So if you're still here, we'll just go see what we have here real quick. I'm not aware of one, though, again, because I don't work in that space. Open source, CMMS systems. And not likely. Oh, no, here we go. KLM EAM. So again, there's probably, looks like there is. There's one called KLM EAM, which is open source. It's community edition. Yes, so there's one. There's probably more, but this is where I would start. And on that note, I could just see here, this is common for open source. You might wonder, how do these guys make money? Like, how does KLM EAM exist as a business? It appears that they have what they call a community edition, which is open source with limited functionality. And then they have an enterprise version, which is closed source. So of course you got to look at the features and you look at the trade-offs between the two and decide which of those two would fit for you. That's a pretty common way that open source software exists as a the developers themselves exist as a business plan. So look out for those. We call that the freemium model. So there's a free version and there's a premium version. Freemium. Okay. Any other questions?
Okay, I have a few more. Do you have any tips for pulling an engineering team out of spreadsheet land to explore different tools, platforms that might fit an application better than Excel?
I would start with lobotomies. No, so seriously. Um, that's a really good question. My initial reaction to that is I think the team, this is getting into human dynamics and team. And I think what I've seen work successfully is that, well, let's just flat out acknowledge it. Change is hard, okay? Change for anybody is hard. And you're asking them to change. You're asking them to move to something they're not so comfortable with from something they're very comfortable with. So what I would choose, and if I was going to do that, is I would first pick off something very small that I know I could be successful with, that I could demonstrate that better, cheaper, faster. It's going to be a win all around. There's some training time and whatnot to get everybody up to speed, but when we're done and we look back, we can say, man, this is such a better way than what we used to do. Something very small. And then again, once the team of engineers has a sense of what's possible, then they might be willing to embrace that in other parts of their workflow. What I would not do is try to make a big, company-wide initiative. Starting Friday, we're not going to use this spreadsheet anymore. That's probably not going to work. I haven't seen much success of that kind of approach in the past. So bite off something that is certainly achievable and make sure it's successful. Set yourself up for success with that small piece in terms of demonstrating the value of making that move. Michelle, is there anything else?
Okay, we have about 5 more.
Okay, I'm happy to stay if you'd like.
Okay, we'll stay on here. There's still over 100 people listening, so if people want to drop off, that's fine. But so, is open source, in your opinion, benefiting the energy services sector, and if so, how?
Oh, that's a loaded question there too. My personal opinion, because of the way I work and the way I've set up my workflows, it's benefiting me, myself, the company. Hey, I'm sorry. It's definitely benefiting me and the company I work for. I think that's because I'm looking for those opportunities. You remember how I said earlier again, I basically approached this to say, I have a need. All right, how am I going to fill this need? I'm going to buy a piece of commercial software, I'm going to build my own, or I'm going to leverage something out of the open source community. Those are basically the 3 options. So because I'm aware, or at least I know where to go to search and say what's available in option 3. And I'm not saying that's always the best option. Sometimes because things need to be done quickly, there's no time to come up to speed, I'm going to buy a commercial package, a licensing, either some short-term subscription or something to accomplish the need. That's clearly the best path. Sometimes, build my own. That's the best path. I can do that quicker than trying to go through the appropriations process to buy software or get up to speed with somebody's poorly documented open source stuff. So I don't want to paint a broad brush over it being better or worse. I really want to say, I look at it as saying, you got 3 options. Consider when you're making a decision, look at all 3. Do some sort of, we call it SWOT, which is basically your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, sort of matrix across those options, and then see what is the best choice for me now. The one thing I will say is that if you're able to have a little bit of a longer horizon, I think investing in open source workflows makes more sense. But the shorter your horizon is, I got to do something this week, tomorrow, this month, you're not going to be able to make the investments into leveraging, I think, a lot of the open source solutions, primarily because they all involve some sort of, what we would call a ramp up, getting familiar with it, getting, able to use it. So that's my short answer. I hope that was helpful.
Okay, do you know anything about DOE OpenEI?
OpenEI, let's see, the Open Energy, I know a little bit about it. Let's see, so there's really 2 initiatives. There's an Open Energy Efficiency, OpenEE, and then there's OpenEI. Let me go see if, let me make sure we're talking about the same one. One moment here real quick. DOE, OpenEI. Yes, okay, so OpenEI, I know a lot about this, but it's, yes, short version is I do. We could talk about this a long time. You'd have to have a more focused question before I could really answer it. So I think we'll punt on that one for now.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, All right, two more. With the most useful software reference for an energy engineering student. Oh, I'm sorry. I think it's supposed to say, what is the most useful software reference for an energy engineering student? Looking for your recommendation.
Energy engineer student. Well, if when I was an energy engineering student and I was trying to learn the fundamentals, like really, book smart, not as opposed to walking through a building and recognizing what I'm looking at, but understanding the fundamental equations of what's going on underneath the hood. I would probably reference, here's the document I would reference right here. So go to Google and we go to Energy Plus, and our friends at Big Ladder, they have put Energy Plus web-based documentation, okay? Remember Energy Plus, now we're not looking at the GitHub site where the software is actually hosted. We're looking at a private sector company who's hosting web-based documentation. They have a set of documentation here called the engineering reference, which is just stellar. If you want to know how things work. So maybe you're familiar with the ASHRAE handbooks of fundamentals, which are the other place I would sort of recommend you go get familiar with as an energy engineer. These are the handbook of fundamentals put into sort of equation form. So yeah, this would be, of the tools I showed you, this would be where I would go. Okay, and again, this is searchable web page. You can certainly search it up here or search it in the web page itself.
Okay, this last one, I'm actually going to combine like 3 questions in one because they're all very similar.
Okay.
So basically looking for tools to integrate or open source software recommendations for energy auditing and building automation systems.
Open source software recommendations for energy auditing. Well, we got the physics engines, and then we've got the middleware. So yes, my blunt recommendation for you is OpenStudio, okay? And it would be a much longer conversation, which I'm happy to have with you outside of this call and whatnot, to go into more detail of why and how that can be used to support energy audits in a, again, better, cheaper, faster sort of way of thinking. The second part of that question, can you repeat again, Michelle? Energy audits and what was the other?
Or building automation systems.
Building automation systems. Well, you're probably, I'm not sure what we're thinking about there in terms of data analytics, perhaps.
Yeah, integrating energy analytics.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what I do for that. Again, I use the R. I use R Studio, which of course sits on top of R, and then I use R packages. So just as one example of this, the latest buzz around many of us is this thing called neural networks, and there are many R packages that you can download that'll teach you how to build a neural network. Neural networks are really useful for predictions and classifying. So you take a set of data and you can try to predict future data, or you can take a set of data and try to bin it into classes. And particularly, you probably heard of Google. Of course, you've heard of Google. Well, they have a open source neural network platform called TensorFlow. TensorFlow, to show it to you real quick, it's really interesting. And so let's just do this, Tensor for R. And here you go. So yes, again, RStudio has a package where you can download this thing called TensorFlow and build yourself neural networks, which again can take in a ton of data coming from a building automation system. And if it's constructed carefully into R, you can either classify or predict using that. And that's state of the art. That's like, state of the art stuff. Very, very state of the art. So using R, TensorFlow, you have access to it. It's all open source. Anything else?
Okay, you actually have one more that just came in. Okay, is there value in developing a tool for early stage energy modeling? And if so, how much effort do you expect to be involved?
Oh, well, certainly there's value. I think it's the way I look at the world is it's sort of a triage waterfall. You know, you got 10 million buildings and you're going to move those 10 million and maybe 100,000 will go to another phase and then maybe 10,000 will actually get investments. But we got to look at all 10 million. So to figure out what those 10,000 are, a waterfall kind of approach. And just to point out, actually, while we're on this subject, I'll make a plug for something that might be useful for what you're just describing. It's actually built on top of Energy Plus and Open Studio. It's called the DOE Commercial Asset Score Tool, the Building Energy Asset Score Tool. And just very briefly, because I could talk forever on this, but I can't with our limited time, which is to say one can use this tool for those early energy audits and their asset audits, okay? So you're assessing the physical and structural components of a building. You're not assessing behavior. You're assessing the pieces that would need to be invested in, essentially, the bricks and mortar. Having said that, this tool, this free tool, Department of Energy sponsored, using Energy Plus, using Open Studio under the hood, you can actually produce an Open Studio model out of this. It exports an Open Studio model, which you can then go post-process and do what you'd like with, you know, use it. So that's a workflow that exists today, would not require a ton of investment, require some training and whatnot. It's not going to work for every building, but there's certainly, again, in that waterfall principle, where if you have buildings of these types, yeah, you got something here. Okay. And again, be happy to talk with you more about that offline. Michelle can provide contact information for me, and you know we can talk in more detail as needed.
Okay, there's one more that came in. It says, what is the link you went to for the big ladder document page?
Oh, sure. So you can get there from our friends at Google by just big ladder Energy Plus documentation. And it'll probably, everybody's Google search is a little different, but that's the one that you're looking for, web-based documentation. And again, when you go there, you want the latest version of Energy Plus and two different documents here. This is a reference of the actual inputs and outputs. This is a reference of what's going on underneath the hood. Okay.